Hi everyone, welcome. We'll wait another minute or two to get started, just as we're letting people in from the waiting room. Welcome everyone, we're gonna wait one more minute to get started as people are coming in from the waiting room. All right, it's 2:32, so I think that we're good to go. Hi everyone, my name is Courtney Cooperman. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a housing advocacy organizer here at NLIHC. And I'm so excited to welcome you all to the second event in the Our Homes, Our Votes 2022 webinar series. For those of you who are new, Our Homes, Our Votes is NLIHC's nonpartisan campaign to increase the voter turnout rate among low-income renters and elevate affordable housing as an election issue. Our elected officials need to know that their voters care deeply about affordable housing and will show up at the ballot box with housing as a top priority. But too often, the lowest income renters who face the greatest barriers to stable, accessible, and affordable housing also face the greatest barriers to voting. That's why it's critical for advocates, housing providers, and tenant leaders to be deeply engaged in election work and mobilize our communities to vote. 2 weeks ago, we held the Our Homes, Our Votes 2022 kickoff webinar featuring an overview of the campaign's past achievements from NLIHC President and CEO Diane Yantel, a discussion of election efforts in Georgia from Georgia ACT President and CEO Dr. Bambi Hayes Brown, a preview of the campaign's communication strategy from NLIHC Senior Director of Media Relations and Communications Jen Butler, a presentation of new research on the connection between eviction rates and voter turnout from Eviction Lab's Jillian Slee, and a special message from Representative Chuy Garcia on the Our Homes, Our Votes Act. And in case you missed the webinar, you can find the recording in the link that my colleague Sid just dropped in the chat. So this last webinar 2 weeks ago covered the why of housing and election work, why voting should be a priority for those of us who care about housing justice. Today's webinar starts to move from that why into the how. We'll dive into the nuts and bolts of what it takes to conceptualize and launch a comprehensive voter and candidate engagement campaign, how to design a campaign rooted in tenant leadership, and what resources from Our Homes, Our Votes and our partners are available to get the planning process started. Caitlin Donnelly from Nonprofit Vote will share key considerations for developing a voter and candidate engagement plan and executing it effectively. And Abby Eng from Tenants and Neighbors in New York will explore how her organization has put these steps into practice to launch their own campaign. And we'll have plenty of time for Q&A with our panelists, so please ask us questions in the Q&A box throughout the webinar. Also just wanted to remind everyone that the webinar is being recorded and we will send out the recording and resources afterwards, and there is closed captioning available. So with that, I will pass it over to Caitlin to get us started.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm Caitlin Donnelly, the Program Director for Nonprofit Vote. I'm really excited to hear that you had a whole webinar on the why of doing voter engagement. I'm excited. I'm going to watch this webinar this week. because I'm really interested, especially about the research on housing and eviction rates and voting. But I'm going to be talking a little bit about the why, hopefully ground you haven't covered already, because I always start from the place of why we're doing this. And then we'll get into really what does voter engagement look like at various nonprofits. So I'll ask for my slides to be shared. Yep, there they are. So this is really just what 501c3 organizations need to know about voter engagement. Of course, lots of political campaigns, PACs, and C4s do a lot of voter engagement, but as nonprofits and 501c3s, we have to stay nonpartisan, but our voices are really important in this space. So this is a little how-to. On the next slide, I have what I'm going to focus on. So the why, the what are the types of voter engagement and voter assistance and information that you want to be sharing, and how to keep those efforts nonpartisan. If you want to read more case studies of groups we've worked with, I'll touch on some of their stories, but we've worked with Colorado Coalition of the Homeless. We did a case study on Rosie's Place. So we have a few case studies of groups that are housing centric. And we have reports showing the impact of nonprofit voter engagement. Those are on our website, as well as lots of guidance on how to do voter engagement activities, a fact sheet, many fact sheets on staying nonpartisan, and links to your state information, because it's very important that we're always following state and local laws regarding everything from registration to assisting voters at the polls. So why engage voters? Gaps really persist even in record-breaking turnout years. So in 2020, we broke about a century's worth of records with high voter turnout, but we actually saw, even though more people voted, the gaps between different groups actually stayed about the same in most states. So we have midterm elections and presidential elections. So of course, this is a midterm election year. And we saw a big jump for across all income brackets, smaller jump in the presidential years, but we still see that those lower income voters, those folks making $40,000 or less a year, are far behind in terms of participation. So we want to make sure that we're still addressing turnout and turnout gaps, even if it feels like more people are heading out to the polls, because of course this distorts the policy landscape and it can feel really disempowering for the voters themselves. On my next slide, I have a finding from our nonprofit power report, where we looked at groups, including Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, many groups in Colorado. We had participants in Michigan, Ohio, North Carolina, and Texas. And we looked at, when we compared the voters that were served by these nonprofits and got, registered or pledged to vote, got GOTV follow-up, compared with voters with matching demographic backgrounds and locations, in the same county, similar age, race, sex, marital status, we saw that the voters that were engaged by those nonprofits had a statistically significant increase in voting. And we saw that it was the biggest increases for the most marginalized voters. So on this slide, it's that low income voters engaged by nonprofits saw a 7 percentage point boost in turnout over comparable voters making less than $30,000 a year. So we know that nonprofits can help close those gaps in voter turnout. You're also really in good company, because this is a growing trend in the nonprofit sector. We recently released a report called America's Nonprofits Get Out the Vote. And what we found is that about 20% of nonprofits And that's like when we really think about nonprofits, this took out like large education or hospital institutions. But when we think of like the nonprofits that serve our communities, about 20% report doing some form of voter engagement in the last 2 years. And that number jumps way up when we look at nonprofits that serve underrepresented communities. So especially low income voters and voters of color. About a third of those nonprofits do voter engagement. And if you dig into this report, you also would find that it's nonprofits that have boards of color, leaders of color, staff of color that are really at the highest rates of voter engagement in their organizations. So we can look to those leaders as an inspiration and where we should be following in terms of what nonprofits need to do to really interrupt these long-standing disparities in voting rates and make sure that our clients, our constituents, and our organizations are really represented in voting. So we hear a lot of different reasons for why voting matters. And on the next slide, I have a few of those things that we hear a lot, these common themes. The first is that voting is beneficial for the individual voter in terms of a sense of agency, a sense of community. We also have a lot of organizations who recognize that the voices of the people they serve have historically been locked out of that process and those policy decisions that impact their life. And so wanting to bring them into those conversations and decisions. Many nonprofits see this as a boost to their own advocacy efforts. When policymakers and legislators know that a community of voters is behind you, they're going to be much more receptive to your proposals and ideas. And lastly, it's an equity issue, right? So as nonprofits, we really have a responsibility to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that includes an inclusive democracy. So I'm not going to spend any more time on the why because I know you did that last time. So let's really get into what are you going to do? So when we think about voter outreach, a lot of times we think of two main activities: voter registration and get out the vote. These are really important activities. Political campaigns do a lot of this. If you see political campaigns or parties at events, they'll be offering voter registration. And then I'm sure many of us have gotten those calls in the weeks leading up to the election, calls, texts, et cetera, from campaigns reaching out, asking us to vote and to support their candidates. However, they miss voters who participate less frequently, so we can't rely on them for that. Their political campaigns, they're doing their own thing. They're really focused on winning or losing and that short election cycle. We care about long-term participation. And so we as nonprofits can really fill that gap for those gaps for the new voters. So voters who have just turned 18 and are now eligible to vote. Also newly naturalized citizens. And a big one is for people who have had felony convictions and been involved with the justice system. Even for those who have not had an actual felony conviction, there's a lot of misperception about how you get your right to vote back, or if you've lost your right to vote at all. I know Circle from Tufts did a study at one point a couple years ago, and they found that a lot of young people thought that any even misdemeanor conviction would result in the loss of their voting rights. So making sure that our justice-involved community really knows what their rights are and that they can participate. If you don't have much of a voting history, you're going to be passed over by campaigns. And so if you've been recently incarcerated, especially if that's been for a longer sentence, the campaigns are just not going to be looking for you or reaching out. And of course, voters who move a lot and voters who have changed their name, they need their registration updated, and they can be a little bit harder to find. So these folks, I think, are definitely part of the community that National Low Income Housing Coalition members serve. So of course, we want to be registering those folks. On the next slide, here are some ideas that I've seen work in a lot of places, including registration forms in your move-in paperwork, door knocking residents to offer registration assistance, placing registration forms in your lobby or in a high traffic area. So just making sure that voter registration opportunities are plentiful, visible, and really inserting them in places that make the most sense. So I think anytime somebody is filling out paperwork, either physical paper forms, or if you're in a state that has online voter registration and you're doing online forms with people, you can include either an opt-in box where you'd follow up with someone for registration. I know Watch, a housing group in Waltham, Massachusetts, local to me, does that, has that opt-in box they just added, but you can also just include that state voter registration form. If laws in your state allow, I do recommend that you deliver registration forms on behalf of voters if they're willing to allow you to do that. How many of us have filled something out and then not put it in the mail? It's very easy to forget or to not have a stamp. So try to take that piece, that burden off the voters by delivering it to them directly. And in most cases, I do recommend having paper registration available because most online registration portals for most states require a DMV or state issued ID. So if you're working with a population who is less likely to have those forms of ID, you're going to want to use a paper form so that they can use the last four of their social security number instead. There's only a couple states that let you use that social security number for online registration. And then there's, get out the vote reminders. So you can be sending postcards with important date reminders, like when early voting is, or their last day to update their registration. You can conduct a phone or text bank to reach out to voters. And again, visibility, put up posters, pass out flyers with state-specific election information, just reminding people that the election's coming and that they should participate. But I think these are not the only stops on the journey to voting. So on the next slide, we have, I think it's a little bit of a longer journey, and there are three really important pieces in the middle that are all part of voter education. So don't skip your voter education steps. On the next slide, we have those three steps. So there's why voting matters. So just making sure that people really are internalizing what voting will mean and how it can, impact their lives and their communities. There's how the voting process works. So like, what do you physically need to do? Where do you need to go? What do you need to bring with you? Where, when, around voting? And last, there's what's on the ballot. And that comes back to the importance of voting, but it also will really help voters feel comfortable and informed. The latest research on people who don't vote or who haven't participated recently show that there's a few things at play. Some voters, some people might call it apathy, but there's a sense among many voters that their one individual vote won't make a difference, that the candidates aren't really different or won't represent their interests, and that they don't have enough information in order to vote. That they feel that they need they're an uninformed voter and therefore should not participate. And I think nonprofits are really well situated to disrupt all those arguments. So first, next slide, we have the why voting matters. So I have a graphic up here, and I really strongly recommend that everyone check out the Why Vote tool from Right Question Institute. They have this great tool. It's called Why Vote, and it helps people think about why voting would matter to them, the issues that they care about, and has them think through their own questions about voting. We've had partners in Colorado and other places use this tool to great effect. But in general, when you're talking to voters about why their vote matters, you want to highlight how it impacts the services that you can provide for them, how it might impact other aspects of their lives, whether that's education, transportation, or public safety. Talk about the historical significance of voting and voting rights. And I think another one that's really relevant to this year is how redistricting might be impacting the election in your state. Many states, every state had to redraw their maps. In some states, it looks very similar to how it did the year before, but in the states that lost or gained representatives, it's going to be a very different map. So now people are sort of voting as part of a different block. And so I think that's an interesting thing to bring up. It's different than it was in every election prior. Next, you want to get into the process. So some people do a voting plan. You don't have to have it be quite as rigid as a checklist plan, but you want to make sure that people understand their options for voting and what that process looks like. So that will be early voting. Where can they do that? When? Where do they need to go if they're going to vote in person on election day? Will they need to bring a form of voter ID? Are there state laws around time off to vote so that they'll know their rights about being able to go out and vote? Do they want to vote by mail? Is that going to be preferential to them? Or if you're in a state that is a mail ballot first state, making sure they understand that process. Or if you're in a state where voting by mail has changed significantly over the last 2 years and what that process looks like. We know in Texas, it's very different, resulted in a lot of returned uncounted ballots in the primary, making sure people understand what that process is, where they're signing, where they're initialing, what envelopes go where. And last, advocates I work with always say, if nothing else, folks should really know 866 Our Vote, which is the voter protection hotline. So folks can get assistance or report any issues they're experiencing at the polls. So whether you are having discussions about this information or putting up posters, you want to make sure the voters you serve have access to this information. And on the next slide, we have preparing them. So, okay, they've made their plan, they're going to vote early, they know where they're going. But when they get into that voting booth, what are they going to see? So you can prepare voters for that by passing out sample ballots, which you typically get from your local elections office. You can educate voters on what offices on the ballot do and the decisions they will make. So completely putting aside the candidates up for election, what are those offices? I know a lot of community organizers say that in 2021, what they found the most success with motivating people was pointing out those local races for sheriff or police and public safety offices, and really connecting that to the protests in 2020 and Black Lives Matter, and showing people like now's your chance. Like, this is the big impact you'll have at the voting booth here. So, really making sure people understand like what the offices actually have the power to do, especially in a climate like we have today, where you might get candidates, talking about issues that their office will actually not have a lot of say in. So make sure they understand what those folks will do. And that includes a lot of offices regarding election administration. A lot of those are on the ballot this year. As a nonprofit, you are allowed to advocate for or against ballot measures, and those are really motivating to voters to have that very direct input. So you can do a lot of education and advocacy around that. And you can also engage candidates. You can co-host a candidate forum or develop a candidate questionnaire. You can also use a tool like Ballot Ready, which I have featured on this slide, that has, shows people all the candidates that will be on their ballot. The League of Women Voters has vote411.org, which is another good tool to help people understand what is on their ballot. When we get to what's on the ballot, that's where I think people start going like, okay, how do we stay nonpartisan while we do this? Next slide. So my recommendations are, first of all, make sure that if you are doing voter engagement, you really train staff on nonpartisanship and what they are allowed to do during staff time and what they're allowed to do during personal time. So everything in the don't category, don't do it during staff time. But things like endorsing candidates, volunteering for candidates, donating to candidates, nonprofit staff can do that on their personal time, not using their organizational credentials, right? So make sure staff understand that difference. When you do talk about any candidates or engage with any candidates, treat them and speak about them in a neutral and unbiased manner. Similarly, treat the people you serve in a neutral and unbiased manner, regardless of their party affiliation or candidate preference. Offer everyone all the same opportunities to register and participate in your engagement opportunities. And make sure you learn your state rules for registration. That could include training requirements, that might include a specific timeline for how quickly you need to turn in completed registration forms. You always want to follow the state rules when it comes to any voter registration activity. So just make sure you're not expressing support or opposition for any candidate or party. That's like the golden rule of nonpartisanship. Don't allow candidates to campaign at your locations and events. You can definitely invite them to your premises and invite them to your events. Tell them you're nonpartisan. You're doing this as an opportunity. You're inviting all the candidates to, meet with your clients and your constituents, but it's not a campaign opportunity for them. I generally say avoid combining issue advocacy directly into voting info or encouragement around voting. I think those messages are best separate, and that is your best insurance policy to not get called out for partisan messaging. And lastly, if you're going to offer incentives or giveaways to get people to attend events where you're offering registration or promoting voting, that's great, but you cannot only do that for people who actually do register. So that's a federal rule. So make sure that if you have those incentives, they're equally available regardless of someone's registration status or voting. So these are, there's a lot more that we can go into in terms of staying nonpartisan. Nonprofit Vote will be hosting a webinar. We host a webinar every year about nonpartisanship with a lawyer who specializes in this subject. But you can go to Boulder Advocacy, which is a project of Alliance for Justice, and they have a nonpartisanship election stuff like Hotline and technical assistance, completely free. You can call them, you can email them, and they'll get back to you if you have questions about, oh, we invited candidates to attend, but now one of them is backing out, or is this messaging that we want to put on this poster okay? They're a really great resource for that. So last slide is just a thank you. You can always email me if you have questions or want some ideas on how you can integrate voting into your activities. But I really appreciate Courtney and National Low Income Housing Coalition for having me, and I will turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. So we've gotten a few really great questions from the audience. So some really good, like, technical nitty-gritty questions. Barbara asked about stamps. You'd mentioned something about voter registration forms and having stamps. And there's some kind of confusion on whether there's stamps required to send in those forms or if the mailing is free.
So I think in most states, there is postage required. There are maybe a couple states where you are not allowed to give voters stamps. I believe Ohio is one of those states. It's considered an item of value. So it comes under that sort of incentive giveaway sort of thing. But so that, that's complicated. But in general, if a voter is taking away a voter registration form, they will either have to hand deliver it to the election office or put a stamp on it and put it through the mail. Typically, the post office will ensure that mail ballots that lack adequate postage still reach the elections office, but I don't think they do that for voter registration forms.
Got it. So it's different for the registration forms and for the ballots.
Correct.
Great. Cool. That's really good to know. And Christy asked a good question. How do you reconcile issue advocacy you've been doing in non-election years with an election year?
That is a great question. And unfortunately, the IRS is really vague around what is allowed. There's this thing called the Bright Lines Project, trying to get the IRS to really clarify. But they have a list of questions that they sort of ask themselves and you if they're trying to determine whether you've crossed the boundary. And if you're doing issue advocacy, just as a matter of course, you're doing housing advocacy and it's just what you do year in, year out, even if you never did any voter engagement, you'd be talking about that stuff. Those messages, sort of coinciding and, you're putting those messages out at the same time you're putting out messages about voter engagement, generally you'll be okay because you have that track record. Now, if you start talking about an issue that's not usually on your docket, climate change or immigration or something, that sometimes is going to be a red flag in terms of nonpartisanship. So, I say in general, try when you're doing advocacy, and you can continue to do advocacy the same as you've been doing it, whether you're doing voter engagement or not, year after year. But when you do bring in the voter engagement piece, I think, again, first of all, try to separate those messages, or if they are linked, just make sure that you're not basically saying, vote for more affordable housing, if more affordable housing is something that really distinguishes the candidates, one's for and one's against. So that's why I think it's easier to just make sure that they're completely separate. But if you can do it very carefully and thoughtfully, you can even link them. And just remember, every year is an election year because those local elections matter.
Thank you. And Christy, I'll just add that we actually have an upcoming webinar 2 weeks from today. We'll get even deeper into these legal considerations about nonpartisanship. So we might get even more information 2 weeks from now about that. But definitely a good question and a really hard balance to strike. We got another question from Manuel. You mentioned disparities of voter engagement with low-income communities and communities of color. Is there any data for the disability community? And what are some efforts to make voting more accessible to people with disabilities?
That's a great question. So National Disability Rights Network and American Association for People with Disabilities both do great advocacy and great voting rights and voter engagement work. AAPD has their Rev Up campaign, including National Voter Registration Week, a National Disability Voter Registration Week in July. Unfortunately, Nonprofit Vote's a small team, and we rely a lot on data being collected by other researchers and firms. And it is not the lack of data on specifically the disability community, which really cross-sects all the other communities I mentioned. There's just so little data out there, and I'm hoping that begins to change. But at this point, other than looking to AAPD or National Disability Rights Network, I'm not sure where you'd find a good data set on voters with disabilities. But I do know that a lot of the recent rule changes, especially around mail voting or the types of assistance people can have around voting, is going to negatively impact voters with disabilities. So it's important that we, make sure that we're reaching out to that community and supporting their right to vote as well.
Thank you. And later in the series, I think maybe towards the end of the summer, we'll have a webinar on barriers to voting, and we'll definitely get into, we'll bring on some experts from one of the organizations you mentioned about people with disabilities and voting. But yeah, definitely an important place for us to focus our efforts. And then I think we have the link in the chat, but just wanted to confirm, what's the name of the organization that produced the Why You Should Vote resource?
It's called Right Question Institute. So I'll type it into the chat just to the hosts and panelists. So you see that? Yeah.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you so much, Caitlin. There may be some more questions coming in for you in the chat, so it'd be great if you can stay on, but I'm going to pass it over to Abby for the second part of our presentation.
Hey everyone, my name is Abby Eng, and I'm the Policy and Communications Coordinator with Tenants and Neighbors in New York. Thank you for having me, and thank you to Caitlin for sharing all that really useful information. And what I'm going to get into today is pretty much showing everyone an example of everything that Caitlin has been talking about, how we're putting our campaign to engage tenant voters into action, kind of following the same steps that she was outlining. And of course, we're still growing and learning as we go along. We're still kind of in the early stages of our campaign. We have primaries at the end of June, and then we'll be ramping up to the general election. But this is, just where we're at right now and how we're thinking about mobilizing and informing tenant voters with the capacity that we have as a small nonprofit. And this is a campaign that is really important to us because we believe there's a huge untapped potential in the tenant and renter voting block. And there's a ton of tenant voting power out there. And especially, we're a nonprofit that does some advocacy work for legislation that protects tenants' rights and preserves affordable housing. And it's really important that our elected officials are on, are pro-tenant and can help us with some of the legislation that we're passing. Of course, with that said, this campaign that we are working on is nonpartisan. It's squarely in our C3 work, although we are also a C4. And so, just to give you some background information on our organization, Tenants and Neighbors is a members-led statewide center for tenant power in New York. And we were founded in 1974. And our mission has always been to build and strategically wield collective power to keep New York diverse and its housing affordable. And we do that through base building, grassroots organizing, and leadership development. And we have organizers who help form and sustain democratic tenant associations on the building level. And then we work on bringing those tenant leaders into the broader housing movement to preserve at-risk affordable housing and help with our administrative and policy reforms. Next slide. And then also to give you some insight into what we're working with as an organization. What is our base and our capacity? We have 3 full-time staff and we have 3 full-time volunteer organizers. And so just 6 of us, and we're trying to do as much as we can with our limited capacity. We are currently organizing in 12 to 15 buildings, primarily in New York City, although we are a statewide organization. And we represent approximately 3,000 tenants in multiple types of housing, but mostly project-based Section 8, rent-regulated tenants, and Mitchell-Lama tenants, and some market rate as well. So that's just kind of where we're coming from, and we considered our capacity as we designed our campaign. Next slide. So our campaign, Our Homes, Our Votes, is an extension of the National Low Income Housing Coalition's campaign. And so a lot of our goals were drawn from the national mission to mobilize tenant voters. And we kind of personalized it for our communities that we work in and for our state. And so the first goal is to expand the pool of eligible voters in low-income communities and subsidized properties. So as I mentioned, the majority of our work is in project-based Section 8 buildings. And I believe that the Our Homes, Our Votes Act includes, that when tenants recertify, that they also receive voter registration information and forms. And so that kind of work goes hand in hand. We also are working on holding leadership development trainings and workshops to educate and mobilize tenants to engage voters. So we don't just want to, as staff, be engaging tenant voters and doing get out the vote work. We want to create tenant leaders who have the information and the skills to be advocates for tenant voting themselves. And that's so that we not only have more capacity this election cycle, but hopefully the impact goes beyond just this election year. And those tenant leaders that we're working with can hold on to those information and those skills to carry on to the next election and to stay civically engaged. Next, we are trying to develop and distribute a candidate questionnaire that we will turn into a checklist or like a scorecard of sorts on a palm card that we can distribute to our active buildings that we're organizing in to inform them on housing and state policy that we are working on. And so we've thought a lot about this to make sure that it does stay C3. And so the candidate questionnaire is nonpartisan and it's not meant to be an endorsement, only to inform tenants on some of the key issues when thinking about who they're going to vote for and if that person they're voting for is going to be on the side of tenants and affordable housing. And then lastly, we want to host 2 tenant candidate nights, one for federal candidates and one for state candidates. And this will give an opportunity for tenants to speak directly with the candidates and some of their elected officials. The next slide. And so we developed our campaign over a series of planning sessions and talking with our members. And the lens that we used to plan our campaign was all about, how can we maximize our capacity to have the greatest and most effective impact. And so as a small organization, we thought the best way to do this is to incorporate this election work into our existing building organizing with tenant associations and leaders. And so this not only, sorry, I wasn't sure if the Wi-Fi is breaking up or not. We want to leverage our existing work because this will create tenant leaders, as I said, that can, take this information beyond this election cycle. And it also allows us to increase our reach to more tenants. And we really want to see our tenant leaders become advocates for this campaign, and really to buy into what we're doing and take ownership of this campaign. It's not like ours as in Tenants and Neighbors campaign, but it's like everyone's that we're working with. We also are trying to strategically target districts where we have a strong base. And so this is, we're doing this to make sure our campaign is manageable for our capacity, and we're not like overloading ourselves with trying to reach out to all the candidates across the state. And so we looked at all the data that we collect on our buildings. We looked at our organizing tracker, and we thought, okay, where will information like a candidate scorecard be most effective and most helpful? And so we're targeting districts where we have active buildings that we're organizing in, where our organizers are working with the tenants to create tenant associations or fight for repairs. And so the outreach, the canvassing that we'll be doing, it will be an extension of what's already happening in the districts where we're most active. And then we're also lucky enough to have access to Van and Spoke and Through Talk to Canvas and Phone Bank. And so we're working on, developing our own knowledge of these tools so that we can share that with our tenant leaders. And then lastly, we are partnering with other local nonprofit organizations in our area to co-facilitate trainings and voter engagement sessions. And this, allows us, this expands our own capacity and gives us an opportunity to partner and expand the messages that we're trying to get across. And I'll also add that when we were planning our campaign, we really kind of sat down and looked at the election calendar and mapped out all the important dates. So, when do people need to register to vote? When does early voting begin and when does it end? And, how can we kind of leverage those dates to plan different voter engagement workshops and canvassing and phone banking. And in New York, because we strongly tend to vote Democrat, a lot is decided in the primaries. So our campaign timeline is really moving quite quickly because the primaries are June 28th, and a lot of the bulk of our campaign will happen before the primaries, and then we'll kind of shift to more, get out the vote stuff towards the general election. Next slide. And then these are just some examples of materials and events that we've had so far as part of our campaign. We launched our Homes, Our Votes campaign on February 15th. We had a Zoom meeting with, I think it was upwards of 50 members of ours to just really discuss what this campaign is about. And to what Caitlin was kind of getting at before in her presentation, this was when we talked about, why vote? Why should you vote? Why does it matter? And then we also introduced the idea that we're putting together this candidate questionnaire, and we got feedback from our members about what they want to see on the questionnaire, like what questions matter to them, what issues, values they want to see reflected in the scorecard. And then we took all that information and we created our candidate questionnaire, which we're currently distributing to all the candidates and working on putting that onto a palm card that's really accessible and easy for people to see and read. Next slide. And then I would say one of our most important tools and tactics is the workshops that we hold. And this is very much an extension of what we already do as an organization. We offer a lot of leadership development, and we, throughout the year, we hold monthly workshops. And so we kind of just shifted some of the focus of our workshops and existing ones that we had planned to tailor to mobilizing tenant voters. And so you can kind of see a list of workshops that we've already held, that we plan on holding. And you'll also notice that some of these, like reporting building violations are not necessarily about about voting, but we have kind of looped this educational component into the campaign because it's an extension of creating tenant leadership, and also kind of providing resources, and a step-by-step guide on like how to call with 311 and take your landlord to court for repairs and harassment. That I think it instills a level of advocacy that can be translated into our voting campaign, and also it's just another way to kind of build and loop more people into our organizations to get them involved in organizing work. Yeah, I think we can go to the next slide. And then I just put our contact information here in case you're interested in anything that I touched on. And like I mentioned before at the beginning of the presentation, we're still developing our campaign and trying to work out some of the kinks. And so if you have any suggestions, we're open to that too. And yeah, I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Abby. It's amazing to see all of the stuff that you have going on, everything you have in the works coming up, and all of the incredible progress you've already made as the primaries are coming up. And we've gotten some really good questions for you. One is from another Abby about a question about metrics. How does your org track the impact of the questionnaire results in the past? Do candidates with a higher score seem to correlate to those candidates having a higher likelihood of getting elected? And do you have strategies of tracking how many people receive the questionnaires and actually show up to vote to gauge success?
Yeah, those are some really good questions. And so this is actually the first year since I've been working at Tenants and Neighbors that we've done a candidate questionnaire. In the past, we've held like candidate forums, and that was kind of our primary way of engaging in electoral work. And so this is also kind of a new experience for us. So those questions are good for me to think about as well as we move forward. But I would say that, we are, so the way the candidate questionnaire will be formatted is, and we ask a series of policy questions that are yes, no. And we're going to format it as like a kind of a checklist or a checkbox. And so if a candidate in the questionnaire says that they support a certain piece of legislation, then it'll just be marked as a yes or a no on the scorecard. And then, to track, who's actually receiving this scorecard and like what is the impact of that. The goal is that the buildings where we will be distributing this information and doing a lot of our canvassing are buildings that we have some contact in already, but are interested in expanding our reach there and to do a little more base building. And so we'll be collecting information as we door knock. And when we distribute the scorecard, that won't be the first time that we're making contact with those tenants. We'll be getting in contact with them prior to that to make sure that they're registered to vote, that they know how to register and things like that. I also see that our executive director is on. So I'm going to invite her to answer some of these questions if she would like to as well.
Great. Yeah, Genesis, if you want to jump in, feel free.
Oh yeah. Hi everyone. Also, I also wanted to mention that we are using, like Abby mentioned, tools like BAN to really track down people, for example, who have not voted in the primaries in the recent years. Some of the issues, we have done some analysis, and we noticed that many of the people we currently organize usually go out to vote in the general elections, but not the primary. So we are targeting specific buildings in which people only vote in those elections, and trying to get them out to vote for the primaries, right? And we are using tools like BAN to track that down. So it's going to help us a lot to make sure we have record of who received the scorecard and who's actually getting out to vote. And we are combining that with test banking and phone banking as well. So it's going to be a all hands on campaign. So like Abby said, it's not the first time they see us. They have, some of these members have participated in candidate forums before. Now we're just extending the campaign to make sure that tenant leaders are reaching out as well to neighbors who have not voted in the recent years. And yes.
Thank you so much. And we got one more question in the chat about broadband access, and how do you make sure that you are reaching voters that may be broadband challenged, whether that's in rural areas, but also I think in urban areas where there is a digital divide?
That's another good question. I think that we really thought about, and I think we've maybe improved a little bit on, as the pandemic has gone on. And a lot of our meetings were happening over Zoom and required broadband and internet access. And so, but we wanted to remain accessible. And a lot of our members are also, they may have like access to the internet and to a computer, but they don't necessarily feel comfortable using those tools to join a meeting or to get on Zoom. And so kind of going back to what Genesis was saying is that, we, a lot of the folks that we're reaching out to, it's not our first touch point with them. So, we, our organizers are frequently in touch with them and can provide them like, hands-on like tech support. And hopefully, if they're not be able to join our meetings over Zoom, we can reach them in person through canvassing and door knocking. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yes, definitely. Well, thank you so much, Abby and Genesis, for giving us all this insight into the incredible work that you're doing. So we only have a few minutes left, but I just want to close us out with a bit of some resources that we have from the Our Homes, Our Votes campaign. If you are feeling inspired, maybe feeling overwhelmed, we have a resource that is a voter engagement plan tool. So it's basically like an outline that walks you through all of these aspects of voter engagement, from registration to education to mobilization. And you can find the link to this document that Sid just dropped in the chat. And the goal of this is to be really interactive. So you'll find a detailed list of questions. So you see on the screen right now, at the beginning, determining your goals, so you can ground all of these tactics that you're developing in why your organization is doing this work in the first place. Then you'll find, as Caitlin talked about, some legal considerations, how to make sure that you are following all of the guidelines, using all the tools available to keep everything nonpartisan. And then the checklist gets into a very detailed walkthrough for making a voter registration plan. So Caitlin and Abby talked about a lot of different activities, and this is designed to really get you thinking about all the nuts and bolts of what it will take to carry out those activities. Who on staff is responsible, what records you'll need, what activities you're integrating into your regular work, what events you're planning. So it's really just designed to be an interactive walkthrough. Then after registration, you get into voter education, all of the relevant items you'll want to educate your voters on, and some suggested activities for doing that. There's also a little bit about voter protection, making sure that the voters that you're engaging aren't affected by disenfranchisement, and making a plan in case that there is that risk in your community. And then the last section of the template is all about voter mobilization, registering voters is crucial, but what ultimately counts is how many show up on election day. So this is a really great way to start setting your get out the vote targets. And even though election day might feel very, very far away, there are some aspects of mobilization that you have to start thinking about early. Like, for example, if you want a ballot drop box at your organization's site, then that's something that will be important to mobilization, but you have to think about that many months in advance. So I know Abby talked a bit about timeline, and this resource is really detailed in terms of aligning your activities with the timeline. So this all sounds like a lot, and I just want to remind everyone, this is a way to work through a menu of possible activities, and really doing voter engagement doesn't mean doing everything on this list. It means figuring out which activities on this list align with your goals and your capacity. So I just want to close us out. First of all, thank you again to all of our panelists for their guidance and their insights. And we so appreciate you. We're excited to have this as kind of the kickoff of what does it take to get your voter engagement initiative off the ground. And next week at this same time slot, we'll be back to our House National Call, which is in a bi-weekly rotation with the Our Homes, Our Votes call. And we'll drop the registration link to that in the chat. And then in another 2 weeks, we'll be back with the next Our Homes, Our Votes webinar, Legal Considerations for Nonprofit Organizations, which I think I alluded to a bit. So if you have a lot more questions about keeping things nonpartisan, tune in 2 weeks from now. And then 4 weeks from now, we'll talk a bit more about strategic partnerships and other resources that are available. So as always, I encourage everyone to follow the campaign on Facebook and Twitter. Stay tuned for our next newsletter. Keep coming to these webinars, and you can reach out to us at ourhomes@nlihc.org if you have any questions or feedback. So I really appreciate all of you being here. Appreciate all of our panelists taking the time to share and to answer questions, and are just excited to have such a great group of people that are doing voter engagement work.